I needed an escape. 6 months after signing my divorce papers, I could barely recognize myself in the mirror. I was tired, drained, maybe even a little lost. When Lauren, my girlfriend, suggested a trip somewhere quiet, somewhere cut off from everything, I agreed without hesitation. I didn't care where we went, I just needed to get away. We found a rental cabin in Vermont, perched on the edge of a frozen lake. The place looked perfect. Modern but rustic, big windows overlooking the ice, thick forest pressing in from all sides. Best of all, no neighbors, no traffic, no reminders of my old life. The drive up was brutal. The snow had been coming down steadily for hours, making the narrow mountain roads slick and treacherous. By the time we pulled into the long, unshoveled driveway, the sun was already setting behind the trees, casting everything in a deep blue haze. And that's when we saw it. A small package, sitting neatly on the porch, dusted with a thin layer of snow. Lauren bent down, brushing it off. A simple white box, about the size of a paperback novel. Taped to the top was a folded handwritten note. "Enjoy your stay, keep warm." That was it. No return address, no signature. Lauren opened the box and laughed. Inside was a tiny box of matches, the kind you get from old diners or cheap motels, plain white with a little strip of red phosphorus. "That's kinda cute," she said, twirling the box between her fingers, like an old-school welcome gift. I wasn't so sure. It didn't feel like something the host would have left. The Airbnb listing had been detailed. Entry codes, heating instructions, even a warning about bears, but no mention of a welcome gift. Lauren saw the look on my face and rolled her eyes. "Ethan, come on, it's just matches." I let it go. I was here to reset. No paranoia, no overthinking, just relaxation. We stepped inside, turned on the heat and unpacked. Outside, the snow kept falling, thickening over the frozen lake. The first 2 days were exactly what I needed. We hiked through the woods, sipped whiskey by the fireplace, watched the snow pile up against the massive windows. It was quiet, so quiet it almost felt unnatural. The kind of quiet that gets inside your head, makes you hyper-aware of every little sound, the crackle of the fire, the groan of settling wood, the wind tapping against the glass like fingers. By the third night, the snow had picked up, turning into a full-blown storm. It wasn't quite a blizzard. The wind wasn't strong enough for that. But it was coming down heavy, swallowing the landscape in endless white. Lauren fell asleep early. I stayed up, staring out the bedroom's floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the storm smother the lake. The house had a skylight, and through it, I could see the faint glow of the moon fighting to shine through the thick clouds. That's when I heard it, a faint humming noise, almost mechanical, barely audible over the wind. I sat up, straining my ears. The sound grew louder, a low whine that sent an uneasy shiver through me. I slid out of bed, careful not to wake Lauren, and crept toward the window, and that's when I saw it. A snowmobile, gliding slowly across the frozen lake. My first thought was confusion. It was past midnight, the snow was coming down hard, and there was no one else around for miles. Who the hell would be out there? The driver moved, cautiously, like they weren't entirely sure about the ice. Then, just as they reached the middle of the lake, they stopped and turned to face our house. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Even through the thick snowfall, I could make out the silhouette. A heavy winter coat, a hood pulled tight, face obscured by the storm. They stood motionless for a long moment, then suddenly waved their arms. A call for help. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me. Something about it felt off. Then I heard it, a woman's voice, faint but clear through the wind. "Please, help me!" Lauren stirred in bed. I turned to her, my heart racing. "There's someone on the lake," I said. "They're calling for help." She sat up groggily, rubbing her eyes. "What?" I pointed to the window. "A woman. She says she lost her kid in the storm." Lauren was fully awake now. "Jesus! We need to do something." I was already pulling on my boots. "Stay inside. Call the police." She nodded. I grabbed my flashlight and jacket and stepped out into the freezing night. The second I hit the deck, the cold punched through me like a knife. The woman was still standing on the ice, her arms wrapped around herself, shaking. I hurried toward her, boots crunching over the frozen lake, the wind slashing against my face. "Where's your kid?" I shouted. She turned toward me, her breath thick and white in the air. "He ran off. I can't find him." I kept moving, closing the distance. She was bundled in a thick fur coat, her hair pulled back into a tight braid. Something about her didn't sit right, but I pushed the thought away. "I need more details," I said, scanning the snow. "How old is he? Where was he last?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she tilted her head slightly and smiled. "Do you still have the matches?" The words didn't make sense at first. Then it clicked. The package, the note. The matches weren't from the host. They were from her. A sharp burst of adrenaline hit me. I took a step back. Before I could react, she reached into her coat and pulled out a gun. "Wallet, phone, now." I didn't hesitate. I threw both to the ground. She scooped them up, then took one last look at me. For a split second, I thought she might say something else. Explain, gloat, anything. But she just turned, climbed onto the snowmobile, and vanished into the storm. I stood there, heart hammering, breath coming in sharp gasps, my mind trying to process what had just happened. Then I turned back toward the house. "Lauren, call the cops!" I ran, nearly slipping, lungs burning from the cold. By the time I burst inside, Lauren was already on the phone, her face pale. The police arrived an hour later, but it was too late. The snow had already covered any tracks. No signs of a snowmobile, no footprints, no missing child. "Could be a drifter," one of the cops said. "These storms bring out all kinds of people." But I knew better. She had been waiting for us. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't random, that she had known we'd be here. But how, and more importantly, why? I wish I could say the police found something, that they called us a week later with an update, that they tracked down the woman, found her snowmobile, confirmed that she was just some desperate drifter who happened to stumble upon us. But that never happened. The snow swallowed everything. No footprints, no tire marks, no evidence she'd ever been there at all. The cops gave me the usual speech. "These things happen. Sometimes people get desperate. You were in the wrong place at the wrong time." But I couldn't shake the feeling that none of this had been random. She knew we were there. She left the matches. She planned it. The thought made my skin crawl. Lauren and I cut the trip short. The Airbnb host refunded us without hesitation. Sounding as confused as we were, we drove back in silence. Both of us too shaken to process what had happened. That silence followed me home. Back in the city, back in my apartment, back in my routine, but nothing felt the same. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her standing on that ice, that awful smile just before she pulled the gun. Sometimes I dreamed she was still out there, watching from the woods, waiting for me to step outside. I barely slept. When I did, I woke up drenched in sweat. I told myself I was overreacting, just a robbery, that's all it was. That's all it had to be. A few months later, I got a call from my brother Mark. "Hey," he said, "you doing okay?" I could tell from his voice that he already knew the answer. "Yeah," I lied. He sighed. "Listen, Claire and I were thinking of taking a trip up to the lake house. Haven't been there in a while. Thought maybe you'd want to come." I hesitated. The lake house. Our family's place. The one we'd spend summers in as kids, swimming until our fingers pruned, sneaking beers from Dad's cooler when we thought he wasn't looking. It had been years since I'd been there, but just hearing Mark mention it made me feel like a kid again. Safe. I needed that. "Yeah, I think I'd like that." 3 weeks later, I found myself in Mark's truck, winding through the dense Washington forest toward the lake. Claire sat up front, humming along to the radio, and Bailey, their old golden retriever, dozed in the back seat beside me. The trees were thick, their branches clawing at the sky, blotting out the late afternoon sun. The deeper we got, the darker it felt. I'd almost forgotten how isolated the house was. Miles away from the nearest town, surrounded by towering pines and silence so deep it pressed against your ears, it sat at the edge of the water, the dock stretching out like an old, gnarled finger. The sight of it should have been comforting, but something felt off. Mark cut the engine. "Still standing," he said, forcing a smile. Claire reached for the door handle. "Let's get inside before it gets dark." The moment I stepped out of the truck, Bailey started growling, low, rumbling, the kind of sound that raised the hairs on my arms. He was staring at the house, his body tense, his ears flattened against his skull. "Hey, buddy," Mark said, frowning. "What's up with you?" Bailey didn't move. He just stood there, staring. Claire laughed nervously. "Maybe he's just not used to the place anymore." Mark patted his leg, calling for him, but the dog wouldn't budge. That was the first sign. The second came when we stepped inside. The house smelled stale, like old wood and dust, the kind of scent that clings to abandoned places. Everything was just as we had left it. Furniture covered in sheets, the old family photos lining the walls, the floorboards creaking beneath our feet. But there was something else, something underneath it all, a faint, acrid smell, barely noticeable, like old sweat and rotting food. Mark paused in the doorway. "Do you smell that?" Claire wrinkled her nose. "Yeah? It's like something's been living in here," I finished. We stood there in silence. Mark shook his head. "Probably a raccoon or something. Maybe a bear got in while it was empty." I wanted to believe that. I really did. That night I slept in my old room upstairs. The bed felt smaller than I remembered, the ceiling lower, the shadows darker. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself I wasn't hearing the soft creak of footsteps overhead. Then Bailey started barking, a sharp, frantic sound, the kind that made my stomach clench. I shot up, my heart pounding. Down the hall I heard Mark's door fly open. "What the hell?" I grabbed my phone, flipping on the flashlight. Bailey was in the living room, teeth bared, his tail stiff, barking at the ceiling, right above us, right where the attic was. A slow, dragging sound, like something shifting in the darkness. Claire's voice was small. "Is something up there?" Mark clenched his jaw. "Only one way to find out." He grabbed a fire poker from beside the fireplace and moved toward the attic hatch. I followed, my pulse hammering. The hatch was slightly ajar, just enough to see the darkness beyond. Mark swallowed hard. Then, without another word, he grabbed the edge and yanked it open. A horrible stench spilled out, thick and suffocating. And then something moved, a shape, crouched in the shadows. Mark swung the poker. A hand shot out, grabbing his wrist. I saw him then. Derek, the old tenant, the one we'd evicted a year ago. His face was gaunt. His skin stretched tight over his skull, his beard long and matted. He reeled back from the light, hissing like a cornered animal. I grabbed Mark and pulled him back. Claire was screaming, Bailey was barking, and Derek just stood there, blinking against the flashlight beam, like he'd forgotten how to be human. Then the police were there, dragging him down, pinning his frail body against the floor. They found a sleeping bag, empty food cans, a knife tucked under his pillow. He'd been living up there for months, watching us, waiting. Mark didn't press charges. I still don't know why. Maybe guilt, maybe pity, maybe something else. But I knew one thing. I was never coming back here. I didn't tell them about the woman on the frozen lake. I didn't tell them how, when the cops led Derek outside, he turned and smiled at me, the same way she had, like he knew something I didn't. Like he was waiting for me to figure it out. I didn't tell them. Not about the woman on the frozen lake. Not about the way Derek smiled at me as the cops took him away. Some things are better left unsaid. I left the lake house behind, same as Mark and Claire, same as everyone else who had ever spent time there and walked away with a strange, sinking feeling in their gut. Some places, I figured, just had a way of keeping their ghosts. I told myself I was done with lake houses, done with cabins in the woods, with the cold, with that feeling of being watched through a window you forgot to close. I was done. And then, 6 months later, I found myself back at another one, this time in Minnesota. It wasn't my idea, it was Eric's. He and I had been friends since college, the kind of friend you only see every few months but still pick up right where you left off. He came from money. Real money. The kind where his parents owned properties they barely set foot in. One of them was a lake house, nestled in the woods, overlooking a still and silent lake. When he invited me up for a weekend, I almost said no, But I was tired of the city, tired of looking over my shoulder, tired of the way every unfamiliar sound made my stomach tighten. Maybe some time away from everything would help. Maybe it was time to move on. The house was beautiful, bigger than I expected, all glass and wood, modern but with that rustic feel rich people love. It was early summer, the lake calm, the air still. Most of the other houses around the lake were empty, vacation homes, Eric told me, places that only saw life a few weeks out of the year. That first night, we sat on the dock with a cooler of beer, talking about nothing, the way old friends do. The water lapped gently against the wood. The trees whispered in the breeze. For the first time in a long time, I felt okay. Then I saw the light. At first, I thought it was a reflection. The way the water caught the last remnants of the sun, bouncing it toward us in quick, bright flashes. But as the sky darkened, the flashing didn't stop. A steady rhythm coming from across the lake. 3 short bursts, 3 long, 3 short. I didn't know Morse code, but Eric did. "That's SOS," he said, sitting up straighter. I frowned. "You sure?" He nodded, pulling out his phone. "Look." He showed me a quick search, confirming it. I stared at the flashing light, trying to make sense of it. A trick? A reflection? A joke? It kept going, insistent, like whoever was sending it was waiting for an answer. "We should call the cops," Eric said. I hesitated. "And tell them what? That we saw a flashing light? What if it's nothing? And what if it's not?" I didn't have an answer for that. We sat there, watching it, debating. Maybe it was just a kid screwing around. Maybe someone had fallen. Maybe it was a broken light. The problem was, none of those explanations made sense. Eric sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Screw it. Let's check it out." I shook my head. "No way. If someone's in trouble, they should call the cops. Why signal across the lake?" Eric smirked. "Because not everyone has a phone, genius. Come on, we'll just take the kayak, be in and out in 10 minutes. If it's nothing, we go back. If it's something, we call for help." I didn't want to. Every instinct I had was telling me to stay put. But Eric was already on his feet, dragging the kayak into the water. I swore under my breath and followed. The lake was calm as we paddled, the water smooth as glass. The only sound was the soft dip of our oars, the rhythmic splash as we moved toward the light. The closer we got, the stranger it felt. The house on the far shore was dark, its dock half collapsed into the water. Something about it felt wrong. We pulled up to the shore, beaching the kayak on a stretch of rocks. The light was coming from the second floor. It was still flashing, slow and deliberate. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. "This is a bad idea," I muttered. Eric ignored me, leading the way up the worn path toward the house. The front door was locked, but Eric had done this kind of thing before. Urban exploring, breaking into abandoned places looking for ghosts. He found a window, nudged it open, and slipped inside. I followed. The house was empty. Not just abandoned, but empty. Stripped. No furniture, no dust-covered remnants of life. Just bare floors and empty walls. It didn't look like anyone had lived here for a long time. "Creepy," Eric muttered. "Let's just find the light and go." We moved carefully, our footsteps echoing in the silence. Upstairs the flashing continued. We found the room easily. It was the only one with anything inside. The light source wasn't a flashlight or a lantern or even a bulb. It was a projector. A small, ancient-looking projector aimed at the window, playing a looped recording of an SOS signal. It wasn't real. Someone had set this up. I felt my stomach drop. "Eric!" Footsteps, fast, heavy, pounding down the hallway. Eric and I froze. A door slammed open somewhere behind us. "Run!" I whispered. Eric didn't need to be told twice. We bolted, sprinting for the stairs. Behind us, something was moving. Something big and fast. I didn't look back. We hit the ground floor, turned toward the window we came in through, and stopped. The kayak was gone. My blood ran cold. "What the—" Eric spun toward the side of the house, his face pale. "Run!" I turned just in time to see a figure rushing toward us, all shadow and speed. We ran for the lake. There was no plan, no logic, just blind animal fear. I hit the water first, the cold like knives against my skin, cutting through my clothes, stealing my breath. Eric hit the water a second later. We swam, hard, fast, the freezing lake dragging at our limbs, our lungs burning, our bodies screaming. I didn't look back, I couldn't. By the time we reached Eric's dock, I could barely pull myself out. My fingers were numb, my breath ragged. Eric collapsed beside me, shivering, soaked. We turned to look across the lake. The light was gone, the house was dark, and the police, when they finally showed up, found nothing. No footprints, no sign of anyone ever being there, just an empty house, abandoned for years. Eric's parents weren't happy. They threatened to sue the town, the cops, anyone they could blame. Eric and I never talked about it again, but sometimes, late at night, I dream about that house. I dream that I'm still in the water, still swimming, still hearing footsteps pounding behind me. I dream that I never made it out. If there's one thing these stories have taught me, it's that the most terrifying things in life aren't ghosts, monsters, or supernatural forces. They're people. People who hide in plain sight, who study you, who wait for the right moment to strike. The unknown isn't lurking in the shadows. It's knocking on your front door, leaving cryptic messages on your porch, or watching from the attic where you least expect it. What happened at the lake house still haunts me, not because of what I saw, but because of what I didn't see until it was too late. I ignored the warning signs. I rationalized the unease, dismissed my instincts, and let myself believe that bad things only happen to other people. But the truth is, danger doesn't come with a flashing red light. It disguises itself as a stranger in distress, a former tenant who seems harmless, or a simple flickering light across the lake. And by the time you realize you've walked into a trap, it's already too late. So if there's one piece of advice I can give you, it's this: trust your instincts. That feeling in your gut that something isn't right, listen to it. If a situation feels off, it probably is. You don't owe a stranger your trust. You don't have to be polite when your safety is on the line. You are not paranoid for being cautious, you are smart. If you're staying somewhere remote, whether it's a rental cabin or a family property, take precautions. Check the locks, inspect the property, look for signs that someone else might have been there, and if you ever find an unexpected gift waiting for you on the porch, maybe don't assume it's friendly. Above all, remember this: evil doesn't always look like evil. Sometimes it looks like a woman in the snow, a lonely old man, or a flashing light across the water. The scariest part isn't that they exist, it's that they know exactly how to find you. With that, I just want to say thank you to everyone who has listened to this story. Your support means everything. If you enjoyed this, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to Enigma of the Unknown so we can keep diving into the eerie, the unexplained, and the truly terrifying. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and never ignore that feeling when the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, because sometimes that's the only warning you'll ever get.